On the bank of the Savannah River in Allendale County, South Carolina, a team of archaeologists is 4 meters below the surface, past the point where most excavations in North America ever go. It's 1998, and Albert Goodyear has just ordered his crew to keep digging beneath the layer where Clovis spear points have been coming up for years. The shovels hit a dark stain in the sand, charcoal, and resting beside it, broken pieces of chert, a hard, glassy stone the region's earliest toolmakers used for centuries to shape blades and scrapers from raw material quarried right out of this same riverbank. This soil sits a full meter below the depth where American archaeology has, for most of a century, drawn a hard line. Below that line, the field has always assumed there is nothing but sterile earth. No people, no tools, no fire. Just river sand deposited long before anyone is believed to have walked this continent, layer after layer laid down by floods and centuries of slow deposition, with nothing human in them at all. If this charcoal is what it looks like, that line is wrong. Albert Goodyear is not an outsider chasing a theory. He's a career archaeologist with the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of South Carolina, and he first identified the Topper site back in 1981, guided to the location by a local forester named John Topper, who had noticed unusual stone scattered along the riverbank near an old quarry. Goodyear spent nearly 2 decades working respectably within the Clovis-first framework before he ever touched this deeper soil. His early excavations at Topper documented a clear Clovis presence, tools dating to roughly 13,000 years old, the kind of find that builds a solid academic reputation rather than threatens one. Volunteers came from across the country to work the site during those years, and Topper became one of only a handful of confirmed Clovis sites in the entire southeastern United States. It was only in 1998, after the upper layers had been thoroughly documented, that Goodyear made the decision to dig below the Clovis horizon at all. A decision most archaeologists of his generation would never have made, because the working assumption across the field was that nothing older would be there to find, and digging deeper meant spending time and money looking for something most of his colleagues believed did not exist. In 2004, he sent the charcoal from that lower stain to Stafford Research Laboratories in Boulder, Colorado, where radiocarbon dating, a method that measures the decay of a specific carbon isotope in once living material to estimate how long ago that material stopped absorbing carbon from the atmosphere. The results came back twice, from 2 separate samples of burned plant matter pulled from the same stain: 50,300 years, 51,700 years. A third sample returned a modern date, which the lab attributed to a later intrusion into the layer, a detail Goodyear pointed to as evidence that the surrounding dates were reliable rather than contaminated. The accepted date for the earliest humans in North America is roughly 13,500 years ago, tied to the distinctive, fluted spear points of the Clovis culture, first identified near Clovis, New Mexico, in the 1930s, and found at sites across nearly the entire continent since. Topper's number sits almost 37,000 years earlier than that. That is not a small revision. That is a different chapter of human history entirely, one that would place people on this continent before modern Homo sapiens is even believed to have fully dispersed out of Africa in significant numbers, long before any confirmed human presence anywhere else in the Western Hemisphere. What Goodyear's team physically recovered in that lower layer were small chert fragments, flakes, cores, and one larger piece Goodyear nicknamed Big Red, each showing what he described as repeated, directional striking, not the scattered random breakage you'd expect from a rock simply splitting on its own under frost or pressure, but a pattern, struck again and again from roughly the same angle, the kind of consistency that suggests intent rather than accident. The pieces were small, many of them suited to fine work rather than heavy chopping, the the kind of tool you might use to carve bone, antler, or wood rather than butcher large game. The stone sat directly beside the dated charcoal stain, buried in sediment that showed no sign of modern disturbance, no root intrusion, no burrowing animal tunnel that could have dragged something down from a younger layer above into a much older one below. The mainstream interpretation, at first glance, was simple. Broken rock and old dirt. That's a common, unremarkable thing to find anywhere along a river system that has been eroding and depositing sediment for tens of thousands of years, where cobbles crack under their own pressure and frost splits stone without any hand involved. But that's only part of it. The fracture pattern on these particular pieces didn't match the kind of random cracking produced by geological weathering, by frost cycling, by a rock simply breaking apart under its own long burial history. It matched, in Goodyear's assessment, the kind of repeated, controlled striking that toolmakers use to remove flakes and shape a working edge, struck from a single, consistent platform rather than shattered from every direction at once. Word of the depth and the date reached the press within days of the 2004 announcement. National and international coverage followed almost immediately, and so did the Skepticism. Colleagues who had spent entire careers defending the 13,000-year floor were not eager to see it move by nearly 4 times that number, based on a single dark stain and a handful of small stone flakes recovered from a South Carolina riverbank. Here's where it gets specific. Topper had already forced one earlier revision to the record, well before the 50,000-year claim ever surfaced. In the years before the deep excavation reached the charcoal stain, a separate team of geologists dated an upper layer at the site. Sitting above that stain, but still beneath the Clovis horizon, to approximately 16,000 years old, using different sediment dating methods entirely, independent of anything Goodyear was arguing about the deeper material. That date has held up under scrutiny far better than the deeper one. It places tool-bearing soil roughly 3,000 years before Clovis. And it did so on its own terms, years before the more explosive 50,000-year number gave critics a much larger target to aim at. That's the quiet part of this story that rarely makes the headlines. Before Topper was known for a 50,000-year controversy, it was already known for a 16,000-year one, and that earlier. More modest claim has largely survived the same kind of scrutiny that the deeper layer has not, cited today in textbooks discussing the early erosion of the Clovis-first model. And then there's the microscope work. In 2015, a doctoral student at the University of Tennessee named Douglas Sain went back through the Topper assemblage, the deeper artifacts, the ones tied to the 50,000-year date, and examined them under magnification, looking for the physical signatures that separate a genuine tool from an ordinary broken rock. He found edge polish, the kind of smoothing that comes from repeated contact and friction during use. He found striations, fine parallel fracture lines consistent with contact against another hard surface under controlled pressure. He found organic residue clinging to some of the edges, and edge damage consistent with cutting or scraping work rather than a single random impact absorbed once and never repeated. What makes Sain's findings carry particular weight is who he was, not Goodyear, defending his own excavation and his own professional reputation. An outside researcher, more than a decade removed from the original 2004 announcement, with no personal stake in whether Topper turned out to be right or wrong, independently testing the physical evidence on his own terms and reaching a conclusion that lined up with what Goodyear had claimed all along. If you're following stories like this one, sites the mainstream timeline hasn't fully closed the book on, this channel tracks them as the science moves, not years after the fact, when a new dig report or a peer-reviewed paper actually lands. Subscribing means you'll see the next verdict on a site like Topper the week it happens, rather than picking it up second-hand months later. The stones were beginning to look more human. But stones, no matter how carefully studied under a microscope, can be argued about indefinitely. The real weight of this story sits with the man who spent his career defending them in public, year after year, while the debate around his name hardened into one of the most contested disputes in American archaeology. Before 2004, Albert Goodyear was a mainstream, well-regarded figure in Paleo-Indian archaeology. His early work at Topper, documenting a clear Clovis presence along the Savannah River, was uncontroversial and well-funded, supported over the years by the National Park Service, the National Geographic Society, and the University of South Carolina itself, along with the Archaeological Research Trust and the site's private owner, Clariant Corporation. That is the kind of research record that builds a solid academic reputation rather than threatens one. Announcing a 50,000-year date changed that overnight. It invited exactly the kind of scrutiny and public ridicule that has ended other archaeological careers outright. The kind of claim that colleagues privately treat as a warning sign rather than a discovery worth celebrating. Goodyear did not walk it back. He kept his university position, kept publishing on the deeper Topper layers, and kept defending the site publicly for the rest of his working career, presenting the evidence at conferences, hosting volunteer excavations that drew participants from across the country every spring for years, and helping build a public exhibit on the findings that still stands today at the University of South Carolina's Salkehatchie campus, where visitors can see the artifacts firsthand. There has been no clean vindication. No wave of newly confirmed 50,000-year sites has arrived elsewhere in North America to close the case decisively in his favor, the way later discoveries eventually confirmed other once dismissed researchers working on different pre-Clovis claims elsewhere on the continent. Goodyear has continued the work into semi-retirement, and the site remains exactly where it stood 2 decades ago. Unresolved, still argued over, still unrepeated at the same depth and scale anywhere else in the region. It's worth stating the mainstream position in full, because it isn't a fringe objection. It comes from serious, credentialed researchers working with the same physical evidence Goodyear excavated. Michael B. Collins of Texas State University and Michael Waters have argued publicly that the deep Topper material may simply be naturally fractured stone, what archaeologists call geofacts, rocks broken by geological pressure, by frost cycling over thousands of winters, or by river action that can mimic the look of deliberate human flaking without a single human hand ever having touched them. Their objection has a specific edge to it, not a vague dismissal. The tool assemblage from the deepest layer looks nearly identical across an enormous span of time, largely unchanged in style and form across roughly 35,000 years, while genuine human tool-making traditions elsewhere in the archaeological record shift and adapt generation after generation as techniques spread and improve. A static, unchanging assemblage reads, to these critics, more like the output of a repeating geological process than the output of a living, adapting culture responding to new needs and new materials over tens of thousands of years. There's a second, more technical objection layered on top of the first. 50,000 years sits right at the outer edge of what radiocarbon dating can reliably measure. Past that threshold, a sample can become what researchers call radiocarbon dead, meaning the method itself starts to lose precision as the remaining radioactive carbon approaches levels too faint to distinguish reliably from background contamination. And a number that reads as 50,000 years old could, in reality, be considerably different from that figure. What the mainstream explanation has never fully accounted for, stated plainly, is the shape and placement of the charcoal stain itself, sharply contained, directly adjacent to the worked stone, in a form that some researchers argue is difficult to produce through accidental wildfire or natural ground-level burning alone. 3 separate lines of evidence sit inside this one site, and none of them depend entirely on the others. There's the microscopic use wear on the deep artifacts, documented independently by Douglas Sain more than a decade after the original find, with no connection to Goodyear's original team. There's the 16,000-year layer above the deep stain, dated by outside geologists using entirely different sediment dating methods, confirming pre-Clovis activity at Topper on its own terms and years before the more contested deeper claim existed. And there's the radiocarbon date on the charcoal itself, run twice by Stafford Research Laboratories, landing within roughly 1,500 years of each other on 2 separate samples pulled from the same stain. None of these 3 threads taken alone proves that humans were standing on this riverbank 50,000 years ago. But together they explain something else entirely: why Topper has never been fully dismissed even after 2 decades of sustained criticism from serious, well-credentialed researchers, and why it has never been fully accepted either. It sits in a category most archaeological claims don't survive long enough to occupy, neither confirmed nor closed. For the official migration timeline, that means the 13,000-year floor is not proven wrong. But it is not entirely settled either. It remains a boundary defended more by broad consensus than by a genuine absence of contradicting evidence, and Topper stands as the clearest ongoing challenge to that boundary anywhere in the eastern United States. Beneath the charcoal stain that Stafford Laboratories dated in 2004, there is more sediment at Topper that has never been excavated. The deep terrace work that produced the 50,000-year charcoal required backhoes, extended field seasons, and sustained funding from sources including the National Park Service and the National Geographic Society. And that level of support has not returned to the site at the same scale since the original announcement drew as much criticism as attention. The dating question itself remains too contested for the wider field to reach consensus in either direction, which makes further funding a harder case to make today, not an easier one. The ground below that charcoal layer is still there, on the bank of the Savannah River in Allendale County, South Carolina, unopened.